Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for agreeing to participate in our research project, Hearts of Freedom. We very much appreciate your participation, and we're looking forward to doing this interview with you, so that's great. Thanks. So, I'd like to begin by asking you what your memories are. I know it's 40 years ago now, but the media was doing a lot of publication about the Southeast Asian wars, etc. What are your memories of those events?
Given my age, you will know that the Vietnam War was a pretty important part of my teenagehood and my university years. I was very much aware of the war. We watched the news every day, and it was the first war that actually came into people's living rooms. I think that that's a common sort of experience of people of my generation. I became very politically active. I demonstrated very actively against the war in Vietnam, against American involvement, and also against Canadian involvement, particularly with some of our chemical companies that were involved in providing pretty devastating chemicals to assist in the war. So I was very much aware and very actively engaged while the war was going on.
Thanks. So I'd like to begin by asking you if you could give us a brief history of your career, especially as it pertains to working with the federal government.
I started working with the federal government in 1974. At that time, I was working in a branch that was then called the Job Creation Branch of then Manpower and Immigration Canada. So it was before CEIC or E&I and all the various permutations and combinations of that particular department. The Job Creation Branch was quite unusual within a federal bureaucracy. We were all kids. We were all young people who were particularly hired to work with other young people in a program first called Opportunities for Youth, and then we also had the Local Initiatives Program and various permutations and combinations. But basically, we were community developers. We were people who worked with groups of primarily young people in communities to develop projects that would address community-identified needs. And we were sort of facilitators. We brought these groups together. We worked with groups that had already come together and needed some assistance in submitting applications to the federal government. The federal government, this was under Trudeau Père, and it was at a time of high youth unemployment. It was at a time of lots of activity among young people, political activity among young people. And it was a very deliberate, I've actually read some of the cabinet minutes from the time not too long ago, and it was a very conscious decision to harness the enthusiastic energy of young people in positive ways rather than in negative ways, and to provide funding to them to, as I said, develop community-based projects that would address particular needs in the community. So over the years, from 1974 until I was seconded, which I'll get to in a moment, to the immigration side of the house, I worked on the labor market development side of the house of Manpower and Immigration, which was twofold. It was primarily to create jobs in the community, but was also to provide skills to young people that they could then transform into other occupations. It was a heady time. It was a really exciting time. We had no idea that we were working in a federal bureaucracy. We were really naive. We had tremendous leeway, tremendous opportunity to do what we thought were important things to do. And when I think about what we accomplished through those funding programs, it's quite extraordinary. I would venture to say that most, and pick the area, most rape crisis centers, shelters for women escaping domestic abuse, recreation programs, daycare centers, summer camps for underprivileged kids, recreation programs and housing projects, theater companies, publishers. I mean, I can name one, like Cirque du Soleil started as one of these projects. So, I mean, very famous, long-lasting institutions. All the local theaters in Toronto started off as either an OFY, Opportunities for Youth, or a Local Initiatives Program grant. So we felt terrific about the work that we did, and we established tremendous networks in the community. So I started off as a project officer and then worked my way up in the organization until I was a director of what was then called the Employment Development Branch. But in those days, people rose very quickly. So I was still really young. In 5 years, I went from, a frontline person to a director of a branch, which was very unusual, but we were baby boomers and the world was open to us. So in 1979, I was acting as the director of the Employment Development Branch with this whole network of people like me who were community developers and community animators and facilitators reporting to me from all over. I worked in the region of Ontario, which was the biggest province for the department and still is. So in 1979, I was asked if I would be willing to be seconded from the labor market development side of the house to the immigration side of the house. I did forget one thing. During my time on the labor market development side, I also had the opportunity to act in another position that was responsible for all training programs in the region of Ontario, and that included language training and that included vocational training. So I had a sense of the training programs as well. In 1979, as I said, I was invited to be seconded to head up a very small unit that was being established to coordinate the flow and integration and settlement of Southeast Asian refugees, Indo-Chinese refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And I jumped at the opportunity, not only because it was just, I think, a wonderful initiative and I was very committed to it, but also it sort of brought full circle my own life, because my mother is a refugee. She is a survivor of the Second World War, and our home had been a kind of reception center for displaced people and for people that had survived the war. So the immigrant community was very much part of my life, and here I was being asked to do something in my professional life which was very close to me personally. So I said yes.
Great. So how did you get involved with the Indo-Chinese people from the perspective of being involved with the immigration section of Federal Government?
Well, we were establishing a new unit in the Ontario region to do all the coordination for all the various aspects of the movement. So we worked obviously very closely with national headquarters people, Mike Malloy and others in his unit. And they were really the ones that we were getting sort of the functional direction from. Although we reported up the line to the immigration people in the Ontario region, they hadn't really been involved in refugee settlement to any significant degree, and certainly not in the numbers that were coming in. So we had a really very direct and very close relationship with national headquarters, which was a delight and a treat, given the individuals that were working there at that time. But our job in the region started, we were involved in a whole variety of different ways. So first of all, there was a network of Canada Employment Centres. There was also a network of Canada Immigration Centres. Neither of those organizations exist anymore. So it was a very different time. The Canada Employment Centres were the organizations that were responsible for receiving government-assisted refugees And nothing was delegated at that point in time to civil society organizations. It was actually staff of the Canada Employment Centres that would receive the government-assisted refugees at the airport, would house them temporarily in hotels, would provide them with income support, would provide them with assistance to find permanent accommodation, would get them into language training or vocational training, would help them find work. That was all done by staff of the Canada Employment Centres. And we, in our little regional office, had direct responsibility for providing them with all the policies, all the guidelines, all the functional direction for their work with government-assisted refugees. Because again, up there, direct reporting, there wasn't much experience in that area, or, well, I'll just say not much experience in that area. The Canada Immigration Centres, they had a whole other network. Many centres in Ontario and across the country. We don't have that anymore. And they did the hands-on work with people interested in sponsoring refugees. So they assisted people to actually complete the applications, which at that time were 2 pages, as opposed to now I've lost count as to how many pages are now required. But they helped them do those applications. They were the ones that actually approved or rejected the applications. They were the ones that monitored the sponsorships once the refugees arrived. And they were the troubleshooters for the sponsors if there was a particular issue that needed to be dealt with. They received functional direction from our little unit. So we had all these people in the field that we were responsible for, as well as giving them direction on the actual programs. We also had responsibility for matching. You know, the CICs, the immigration centers, would approve the applications from the sponsors. At that time, there were practically no named applications. The sponsors didn't know who they were going to sponsor because there was no Vietnamese community to speak of at the time, so we didn't have names of people that needed help. So the CICs would send to us the sponsor organizations, how many people they were prepared to sponsor, how much money they had been able to raise, what accommodation they had available, and national headquarters would send us telexes, don't exist anymore, telexes identifying the refugees that had been selected overseas by our visa officers in the camps, no longer exist, who had identified people that they had approved to come to Canada. And the regional offices, our little unit, matched the sponsoring organizations with the refugees so that they would know who was coming, when they were coming, etc. I remember that, you know, we did this all, we didn't have computers. We had what I call recipe boxes with like index cards, alphabetical index cards in these recipe boxes, and we did everything manually. All the matching was done manually based on, you know, cut telex pieces of paper and sorting through these recipe boxes to find potential matches. And then, you know, the staff in the unit would call up a sponsor and say, "Oh, do we have a wonderful family for you?" I mean, they knew nothing about the family except the 2 lines, but we would match, and people would get very excited about the family that they would be sponsoring. We also did a lot of work in my unit reaching out to promote sponsorship and to work with the sponsorship agreement holders. Even then, there were a number of sponsorship agreement holders, primarily in the faith communities. We worked very closely with the Mennonite Central Committee, with the Christian Reformed Church, with the United Church, with many, many synagogues. There were a huge number of synagogues that were involved in the sponsorship of refugees. So we worked with the SAWs, the sponsorship agreement holders, and to promote sponsorship among Jane and Joe Q Public, and attended many public meetings and organized many public meetings to encourage people to come forward. We also were responsible for the implementation of what was then called ISAP, the Immigrant Settlement and Adaptation Program, which was a contribution program to community organizations, which were not nearly as sophisticated as they are now, and there weren't nearly as many then as they are now, but organizations that provided settlement assistance to refugees and to immigrants. But they didn't have, like the reception centers they now have, they didn't have as much expertise working with refugees then as they do now. But we also use that funding again to do not only community development but organizational development. So we funded, for example, the first Vietnamese association, the first Cambodian association, the first Laotian association, so that they could help their fellow nationals in the settlement and integration program. And some of those organizations were just fabulous, and they really provided real leadership in the communities, and they existed for a very long time. We then began to realize, and this was sort of fairly early on in the process, that when you send a whole group of people to communities that perhaps had not received before that number of refugees, particularly from parts of the world that were not present already in those communities, that more work was necessary to be done to prepare the communities for the newcomers that would be coming, and to get all the community organizations in a particular community working together. So we decided to hire refugee liaison officers. And that was, I think, a really brilliant idea. And we went, I mean, I certainly knew all the people who had been working with me in the employment development branch, and those were exactly the kind of people we needed, who both had the community development, community animation, community facilitation skills, and were the kind of people that would be innovative, would take risks. They were not bureaucrats. They didn't need to be told, you know, first you do this, then you do this. They just intuitively knew how to work in their communities. They had lots of experience doing it. So we hired a number of RLOs, Refugee Liaison Officers, across the country, and they were fabulous. They brought communities together. They did the work now, and I'm not sure who will be watching this tape, but they did the work then that LIPs now do. Local immigration partnerships exist now, but they would bring together sort of community councils, people in the health sector, in the education sector, social services sector, police, employers, I mean, any training organizations, anybody who would come in contact or should or could come in contact, and to organize themselves in a collaborative, coordinated way to provide the supports necessary on a local community basis, but also to be troubleshooters and to nip things in the bud. So if there was a problem that came about in a particular community, there was a person on the ground who had the skills to intervene and to calm the waters. And that was tremendously useful. They were also the eyes and ears, as were the people working in the immigration centers and the employment centers. They were the eyes and ears on the ground to see how things were going, and it was an automatic feedback loop back to national headquarters to revise policies, to revise programs, to respond to things that nobody had thought about before. And that loop, I think, was tremendously important, really useful. And you also had people at national headquarters who were remarkably receptive to all the news and views, you know, from the field. And there were mechanisms, you know, easily, despite no internet, they were very receptive and very accessible to hearing about the issues, the concerns, or just really good ideas. You know, any innovations that were applied in one community, so they could be applied elsewhere as well. The other thing that we did, which I think was really helpful, I co-chaired as the head of the Ontario region project for Indo-Chinese refugees. I co-chaired with one of the assistant deputy ministers at the province of Ontario what we called a settlement planning and programming committee, which had representation from cities, representation from the United Way as the kind of civil society rep. And we met on and we had representatives from all the federal departments that had a role to play in this, as well as all the provincial ministries that had a role to play in this. And we met on a very regular basis to identify priorities and to identify who would do what, and if a problem arose, who would fund what. We collaborated in our funding of community organizations, and it was quite extraordinary to get that three levels of government sitting together on a regular basis doing this planning and involving the United Way as a kind of proxy for a lot of the civil society organizations. So that was an innovation that we came up with that I think was really important for this particular movement.
Thanks. Great overview of so let me continue. In terms of the partnerships with the provincial government and the municipalities, were there discussions about who would be responsible for what? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, immigration, as you know, is a shared jurisdiction between the federal and provincial governments. And over time, who does what has evolved. And at one point in our history, provinces were really hands-off, and another point of our history, provinces were the lead. But according to the Constitution, the federal government has primacy, but it is a joint jurisdiction. There are areas constitutionally that the province has primary responsibility for that were very pertinent to the settlement and integration of refugees. So they're responsible for health, they're responsible for education, and we had to work very closely with them to ensure that they were prepared and they were ready to do what was necessary. So the need to cooperate and collaborate with the province was very, very high. So we made arrangements. I mean, how are all these refugees going to get in Ontario, their OHIP cards? You know, how are they going to get their children enrolled in school? How will the schools respond to many, many, many people coming in a very quick time period? To get their educational needs met, given that nobody spoke English or French. Some of the older people spoke French, given the history of Vietnam, but generally speaking, the people that were coming in, and certainly the children, none of them spoke French. So we had to work very closely with the province, and the province in Ontario, I can't speak as well for all of the other provinces, but I know in Ontario, the province really stepped up. They did a fabulous job, both, in all the areas of their jurisdiction. We had a handicapped refugee program, which I don't think we have anymore. But I would get, again, telexes from the visa posts after some of the individuals had gone through their preliminary health exams, identifying people who were they were very vulnerable and they had particular needs, and everybody knew that they would require significant health intervention, and that would be a provincial cost. So I would get these faxes, or not faxes, telexes, and I would have to discuss with my provincial counterpart whether, or because they had the final say about whether those refugees would be admitted or not. The province did not refuse a single case. So that was terrific. I mean, they and I don't remember the numbers, but every single case that we proposed, they accepted. With the education systems they set up all across the province, depending on how many people were going to each community. In some cases, special reception schools, in some cases, special reception classes for kids entering the school system. In some cases, just hired significant additional teachers' aides to assist and put into place special ESL classes for kids that were coming into the school system. But they really did a remarkable job with the kids. And then we had one of my favorite programs, which was the unaccompanied minor program. So this was a really interesting initiative. These officers in the camps started identifying that there were unaccompanied minors in the refugee camps that whose parents' whereabouts were generally unknown. In some cases, there were witnesses that the parents had died in the boat travel. In other cases, they may have been in different boats and parents may have ended up in different refugee camps than their kids. In other cases, the parents may have put their kids on the boats to save their lives, but there was no room for them, or they couldn't proceed at that time. In any case, there were quite a few unaccompanied minors in the refugee camps, and the visa posts were asking, what do we do with these kids? Canada decided that they were going to receive a set number of unaccompanied minors if there was a program put into place specifically for them. And because children, the protection of children under the age of 18 is the responsibility of the provinces, we could not do it on our own as a federal government. We had to work very closely with the provincial authorities. So I was the lead hand at the time to negotiate that agreement with the province of Ontario, and I sat across the table from the Assistant Deputy Minister of Children's Services at the province of Ontario, and we, assisted by many others who had real expertise in the area, either in adoption or in foster care or in child protection or with child welfare agencies, we designed a program. It was really so interesting because we had to recruit families to take in these kids, and they weren't really kids, I'll get back to that in a moment, who had no aspirations of adoption because we didn't know where the parents were, and they were not necessarily, the aim of the whole program was to reunite the kids with their parents. So we couldn't have families, Canadian families in the program who saw this as a way to adopt a child. Nor did we want to use the network of people who foster children, because many of the Canadian families who foster children expect payment for that. Some of them even do it to increase their income somewhat, although they certainly didn't get a lot of money for it, but we didn't want to raise expectations of any fees. So we had to recruit families who understood what they were getting into and understood when it became clearer to us that these kids in the camp were not 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds. They were primarily teenagers, primarily teenage boys, some of whom had to survive on their own for a while and perhaps had been doing things that teenagers in Canada are not expected to do or not allowed to do. And they had lived through some pretty painful experiences. So it was difficult to recruit families to take in these teenage boys, and some of the teenage boys actually weren't teenagers at all. They might have been into their 20s, but they had heard about an unaccompanied minor program as rumors spread in the camps, and all of a sudden they were all 17 instead of 23 or 24. But then when they're 23 years old and living with a family that expects a 17-year-old, sometimes the expectations are not terribly in sync. So it was a complicated program. But we recruited a series of really wonderful families who knew what they were getting themselves into. They all had to undergo intense scrutiny by the province. They had home study programs. They had to go through medicals. Their, houses were inspected to make sure that the minors would be housed properly and not, on a couch in the basement or something. And they had to agree to be actively involved in trying to find the kids' parents. And they had to agree to be monitored on a regular basis, not only by the home study people from the province, but also by immigration. So they were very special people, and the program was remarkably successful. I and my colleagues who were involved in this program, we've been invited to graduation ceremonies, to weddings, to the unification of ceremonies between them and their parents. Many of the children were in fact reunited with their parents. It was a not known. This program is not very well known in the history of this whole movement, but I think it was a very, very special initiative. I went out to meet the first group of unaccompanied minors that came on a special charter plane to Griesbach, which was one of the staging areas in Edmonton where all the refugees first came, if they did not go to the one in Quebec. But the unaccompanied minors came to the staging area in Alberta. And I don't think I cried so much as when that first plane landed, and I don't know what you call it, but the door of the plane opened, and the ladder, whatever it was, the staircase was opened up, and a series of it was a military base that they came to, and soldiers dressed in their green uniforms. It was the middle of winter, it was in February, and the soldiers trooped up the staircase, and each of them came out carrying, wrapped in blankets, one of the unaccompanied, I'm going to start crying now, carrying one of the unaccompanied minors down the stairs, because they were wearing t-shirts and shorts and flip-flops. And if they were lucky, had a green garbage bag of some of their stuff. But it was really cold. And I have never seen a group of soldiers more tenderly carrying these people wrapped in blankets down the stairs. So we had arranged for these children, and some of them were younger than 17, and some of them were girls, to stay in the staging area a little bit longer than most of the other refugees. We had Vietnamese interpreters assigned to the kids on a 24/7 basis. And some of the younger ones actually, insisted on sleeping with some of the Vietnamese interpreters that we had, on a little cot, just because they were scared and they didn't know where they were and what was happening. And we had wonderful interpreters who took on these kids while they were there. But we had arranged for every one of the receiving Canadian families to put together a scrapbook. And the scrapbook contained pictures of the family members, with their names, and pictures of their house, pictures of the school that the kids would be going to, if they had pets, pictures of the pets, and anything else that the families thought would be of interest to the children who would be coming to live with them, of the room and they would be sleeping in, and how the room was decorated, just to welcome them and to give them a sense before they went to the house as to what to expect. And I sat with 2 children and went through, with an interpreter, went through the scrapbook of the family that they were going to be going to. And this was a 15-year-old girl and her younger brother, who I think at the time was maybe 6. He was a young child, and she had been taking care of him for all the time in the boats and in the refugee camp, and was really a remarkable 15-year-old young woman. And I went through everything with them. and spent some time with them during the orientation period that we put on for them in the reception center. And I knew all these kids' files. Before I met them, I knew everything about the families they were going to, and I knew, their names and ages and their particular circumstances, etc. So, fast forward. This was in 1980, February 1980. It might have been 81. I don't remember, but it was maybe February 80. Fast forward to 1998. So that's 18 years later, let's say. I was called to do jury duty. And in Toronto, when you get called to get jury duty, you sit in a big lounge, lobby kind of area. And every once in a while you hear names called. And if your name is called, you line up and you troop upstairs to the courtroom, and it's determined whether you will or will not be part of that jury. As I'm sitting in this lobby, I hear a name. And it's the name of the then 15-year-old girl. 18 years later, she's 33 years old.
Yeah.
She looked similar, even though it was 18 years later, but the name, I just remembered it distinctly. And I went up to her and I said, "Are you?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "Did you come to Canada in 1980? She said, "Yes." "Did you come with your little brother?" "Yes." "Did you go to Madame?" And I gave the name of the sponsoring family. She said, "Yes." And she said, "How do you know all this about me?" And I said, "Well, I was there when your plane landed, and I met you then, and I met your brother then." She's thinking, and she's looking at me. And then she burst into a smile, and she said, "You went through the scrapbook with me." And we hugged and embraced, and I asked her all about, and she had been reunited with her parents. And her brother had graduated from, well, he was 24, so he already had his undergraduate degree and was doing his master's in engineering. She had not continued on because she felt really responsible to work as soon as she graduated from high school, because she wanted to contribute to the costs of bringing her parents over. So she had sacrificed herself for her little brother. But she was happy, and she remembered, and she was very pleased that her parents had been able to come. The end of the story is she was selected for jury duty and I wasn't, which I think is just a wonderful Canadian story. So that was just an example of the federal-provincial cooperation that was absolutely essential and worked really well, with the province involved both up front and on a continual basis to monitor those kids to make sure that they were being well taken care of. And then immigration's role, obviously.
At that time, the federal government was sponsoring refugees, and there were private groups that were also sponsoring refugees. Can you talk about the differences between the federal government's role in dealing with the refugees as opposed to the private groups, how they went about?
It's actually not that much different than it is today, except in who does it.
Okay.
So then the government-assisted refugees were assisted by federal government employees in the Canada Employment Centres. Today they're assisted by designated RAP organizations, which are not-for-profit civil society organizations that are responsible for receiving them, putting up in temporary hotels, referring them to social services and everything that they need, providing them with the income support. So the same kind of thing, except done by very different players. Privately sponsored refugees in the olden days were supported by sponsors, but the intermediary was the Canada Immigration Centres. Now, in Canada, there really aren't any intermediaries, which is, I think, a concern. The sponsorship agreement holders then were much more actively involved in ensuring that the groups that they recognized as their constituent groups followed up on what was necessary to be done. Now, I think the SAWs, the sponsorship agreement holders, are they're not funded, and they're incredibly busy. They're not terribly well resourced, and they don't necessarily have the capacity to follow through the way the SAWs did then. And they have no CICs to help them out with if they run into difficulty. So I would say that private sponsors generally today are more on their own than private sponsors were then. And generally, it works, but I think in times of difficulty, it would be nice to have some intermediary to assist, to support, to monitor, to train, to recruit. None of that exists now, with the exception of the RSTP, the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, which is one organization for the entire country, rather than local Canada immigration centers and refugee liaison officers all across the country, which is what we had then.
I'd also like to ask you about the federal and the provincial role with Project 4000, for example, or Operation Lifeline. Can you talk about how that worked?
I'm much more familiar with Operation Lifeline than I am with Project 4000 because I lived in Toronto, and Operation Lifeline started out as a Toronto-based thing. Yeah. The story that Howard Edelman likes to tell, Howard Edelman was the founder of Operation Lifeline. He was a philosophy professor at York University at the time. He's now an emeritus professor. Better that you get it from him, and I understand that you will get it from him directly, but the mythology is that the whole Indo-Chinese refugee movement was a bottom-up exercise that was really started, and the motivation and the impetus came from civil society, and government responded. Howard says that's not the case at all, and that it was really government that made the initial determination that they were going to do something. And because of their leadership, civil society had a role to play, and then they really grew and certainly influenced government policy. But the initial impetus was top down and not bottom up. So Lifeline Syria began because Howard wanted to get his local member of parliament to do something. And he was thinking about maybe getting a little group of people in his neighborhood involved in the sponsorship of a few refugees. Started off teeny, teeny, tiny. And he had a meeting in his living room. He talks about, and I know it from the other side, he talks about all of a sudden there being a knock on the door, and two individuals in suits are at the door and say, "We're from the government of Canada and we're here to help you." And they actually meant it. And those were two people who worked in my unit who had heard about this meeting. I actually don't remember. And these two people who were sent knew about the private sponsorship program and said there's actually a vehicle that exists, an actual program and application forms, and you can actually do so. You don't have to, try to convince your member of parliament to do something. There's actually a process and program, and we'll help you do it. Unbeknownst to Howard, there was someone in that meeting who was a stringer, a freelance reporter for the Toronto Star, because he happened to live in the neighborhood and came because it was a neighborhood meeting in Howard's living room. Well, he went and wrote a story about this little group that had gotten together, wanting to do something about Vietnamese refugees, and he got his article published in the Toronto Star, and he gave it a name. I don't know whether it was the editor who assigned a headline or whether this reporter used it in his story, but he said, yesterday in a living room in downtown Toronto, Operation Lifeline was born. There was no such thing as Operation Lifeline. Howard didn't even know that those were the words that were going to be used. And that caught like fire, because Howard's phone all of a sudden started ringing off the hook with people from all over the country saying, we want to join Operation Lifeline. And Howard said, there is no Operation Lifeline. Well, we want to join. He said, well, you are now the president of Operation Lifeline in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And the woman said, thank you very much. And she went out and organized stuff in her community. So it was a non-existent organization that soon became national because of these local chapters all over the country. And they did wonderful, wonderful things, promoting private sponsorship and doing, training guides for sponsor groups. It hadn't existed. Nothing existed at the time. So what to do, how to prepare, how to go about, and they made it up because there was nothing at the time. So that's how it began. In Ottawa, it was Marion Dewar, who was the mayor at the time, who was the mother of Stephen Dewar, who indicated that Ottawa wanted to play a role, and Ottawa was going to encourage in some way 4,000 Indochinese refugees to come to Ottawa. That's how the name Project 4,000 arose. But I'm not sure about the details about how that all came about. But then like organizations just popped up. Yeah. And there were the people in the Canada immigration centers and the refugee liaison officers to assist.
In addition to the unaccompanied minor program, can you recall other opportunities where you would have met refugees or interacted with them or had experiences, or maybe you heard stories from your colleagues or from the employees that you worked with about the experiences of refugees arriving in Canada?
Well, I mean, I was working out of my office more than not, and working with the CICs and CECs and RLOs, doing all kinds of training programs with them, etc., and meeting people that they were meeting with. Yes. I mean, they were my entree to organizations. And the Vietnamese Association, the Lao Association, the Cambodian, that we funded, they were also the ways that I got involved or got to meet the actual refugees. I was not a member of a sponsorship group then, as I am now with Syrians, but then I was not involved in sort of the on-the-ground work with the refugees. I was an observer, a monitor, a coordinator, but I was not directly involved, except for, now this is a whole other group that was a really interesting group. These were the Hmong, yes. The Hmong refugees. So the Hmong were a hill people in Laos, and they had acted as scouts for the Americans during that period of time and during the wars. And they were being punished terribly, or could have been punished terribly, because of the work that they had done with the Americans. So the three major resettling countries, and that was the United States, Australia, and Canada, indicated that they would help the Hmongs. The Hmong lived in clans. They were a polygamous group. They were growers of poppies. They were opium smokers. They were a pre-literate society. Their language was not a written language. And they were hill people. This was going to be a difficult group to settle in Canada. but we said that we were going to assist, and I think it was only our region, only the Ontario region, that received any of them. We thought it would be really a good idea to settle them in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, which is an agricultural area primarily. We thought that if we worked with SAWs that were used to or were involved in agricultural activities, that would be a good way to go. So our refugee liaison officer in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, who was wonderful, worked with the Mennonite community, with the Christian Reformed Church, and with other churches, but primarily for this group, my recollection is primarily the Mennonites and the Christian Reformed Church. And they were very willing. We didn't know as much about the Hmong then, and maybe our visa officers did learn more, but we weren't told. What I told you now in synopsis about them, we didn't know when we were working with the Mennonite Central Committee and Christian Reformed Church. Now, I'm going to tell a story that I think is accurate because I have heard it many times, and I hope it is accurate. The Americans honored their commitment to take Hmongs, but generally insisted that the head of the household, who was determined to be a man, would bring with him one wife and the children from that one wife. They were only going to accept nuclear families, and they left behind the other wives in the polygamous relationship and the children of those wives. The Australians came in and picked up the women, primarily the young women, and their children, on the assumption that they would be fairly easy to integrate, particularly if they were young women, because they would marry and they would integrate into the Australian culture. Canada was not prepared to follow either of those models, and visa officers selected clans. But they didn't tell us in the telexes that this was wife number 1, wife number 2, wife number 3, wife number 4. This was wife, this was sister-in-law, this was cousin, this was mother, this was, so they identified the families as a family, but not with the true relationship. So we settled them in the clans with the sponsor groups, and all of a sudden the RLO started getting some very interesting phone calls from the sponsors saying, there's some very unusual relationships here because the head of the family is treating his sister-in-law like he would his wife, or is treating the cousin the same way as he treats his wife. And they were beginning to realize that these were polygamous families, and these were church folk who didn't quite know how to deal with all of this. To their credit, they dealt with it remarkably well. And they just were very accepting of the family unit as the family unit was. What was more interesting, and again, the RLO, the Refugee Liaison Officer, takes all the credit for this, she encouraged the elders of the community to meet, and they did. And the elders of the community met to have a discussion, first by themselves and then with their sponsors, about what parts of their culture they understood could not survive in Canada because it was illegal, and what would they have to give up. What elements of their culture were absolutely essential to them to continue as the people they were, and what was negotiable. And what could they keep for this generation, but absolutely not for future generations. And they went through this very deliberative process by themselves to come up with, so polygamy would be fine for that generation, but not for their children. You know, growing and smoking opium, not even now, and not, for their children. And they just went through literacy. They wanted to be literate. They wanted their children to go to school. They wanted, and it was quite an extraordinary exercise. What was not more, but equally interesting was some of them went into agriculture and did very well, but the women, because they were pre-literate, they are incredible embroiderers, and they embroider their stories. So I was given the most beautiful wall hanging embroidered by a group of Hmong women and given to me, which was wonderful, that told their story. So it starts in Laos, and they're in the hills, and you can see the poppies and them tending the poppies, etc. And then you see them crossing over the river, the Mekong, into Thailand, and you see them living in barracks in a refugee camp in Thailand, and then you see bombs coming down where they were, airplanes and explosions, and then you see an airplane taking them to Canada, and then you see them landing in Canada, and it's all on this wonderfully embroidered, delicate embroidered, beautiful story. They had such excellent, fine motor skills, and KW is the head of automotive parts. And you need, for all these teeny little parts, incredible fine motor skills. So the women got jobs in all these parts manufacturing companies, and quite well. I mean, they did the work very well. So it was a very interesting settlement process, and the communities were terrific in KW, and the sponsor groups were really terrific.
You talked about some long-term relationships that you would have developed with some of the refugees that you served over the years. Do you still have memories of those relationships? And my understanding is you were invited to weddings. And
yes. This was particularly with the unaccompanied minor kids, okay. Because those files came to life. They were just files. They were just paper. And then when I went to Griesbach and I met them, and then I'd get the monitoring reports and follow their education and follow what was happening to them. And the sponsor groups were constantly, in touch with them and in touch with us. Yeah. So when weddings happened or graduation ceremonies happened, we were invited to attend, and it was a thrill to be part of that.
Finally, one of the priorities of this project is to tell tell the new generations about what happened historically in Canada 40 years ago. Impress upon them the importance of welcoming that population to Canada. I'm wondering, do you still have opportunities to share that with? I
do it all the time. Okay. So first of all, this movement, I think, was a tremendously successful movement. Yeah. And people really integrated well. They really they integrated beautifully, and the children in particular. There was a time after the movement when the kids were growing up. When you looked at the provincial standings of high school graduates, all you saw were Vietnamese names. These kids were doing so well in school. And when you look now at the accomplishments of that whole movement of people, sure, there were some problems. There are always problems, but overall, it was a hugely successful movement, which I think Canada was really proud of, and Canadians were really proud of. And it was always something that I thought should be, not just me, obviously, shouldn't be a one-shot deal. We got it because we got the Nansen Award, for example, not because of what the government of Canada did, but because of what the people of Canada did. And at that time, you couldn't go anywhere in Canada without finding someone who was either directly involved in the sponsorship of Vietnamese refugees, or knew someone who was directly involved in the sponsorship of refugees, or worked with someone who, had hired a Vietnamese refugee. I mean, everybody in Canada was somehow touched, affected, and positively moved by the experience. And we should capture that on an ongoing basis, for other refugees from other parts of the world, and not just look back to 40 years ago, wasn't that wonderful what we did, but so, when the Syrian refugee movement was, when the Syrian crisis, because it hadn't yet become a movement, when the Syrian crisis began, a group of us that had been involved in the Vietnamese movement, and Mike Malloy was certainly very instrumental in this, but there was a grant received from Heritage Canada to have a conference to allow for the documentation of what happened then from a whole variety of different perspectives. Yeah. And we had a conference, and we invited the refugees themselves, some of the sponsors, people who had worked as visa officers, people who, like me, who had worked in Canada for the federal government, people who had worked for the provincial government, municipal government, civil society organizations, elected politicians, media people who had covered the Vietnamese sponsorship exercise, whatever. We brought them all together at York University, and it was just a fabulous, fabulous conference. And I said, and others too, that it's crazy if we're just getting together to talk about the past. How do we use this to go forward? And what are the learnings that we can apply going forward? And it was another time, it was under the previous government, the Conservative government, that had not expressed much interest at all in bringing in significant numbers of Syrians. And the media had not yet really captured the crisis adequately at all. And three of us, Mike Malloy and Howard Edelman and I, took it upon ourselves to start writing op-ed columns, to start dealing with the media, to start writing papers, sometimes in brown envelopes under the table, to civil servants in the federal system, to policy advisors of the political parties, to say, Canada has got to do more. We know how to do it. We've done it before. Canadians are eager and willing, and they are a resource that needs to be tapped, but you have to show some leadership, federal government. You have to take the lead, and there will be many, many, many who follow. And those op-eds and those articles, and we crisscrossed the country. We spoke at many conferences, and we spoke to, and then we came up with a really interesting idea, I think, which was, if the current government is led by economic reasons to do things, there is certainly an economic reason to do this, not just a moral one or a humanitarian one. And we started meeting with employers and sector councils across the country in the agriculture sector, the hospitality sector, the tourism sector, food processing, food packing, all of whom had become totally dependent on temporary foreign workers because they couldn't find workers to do the work that was necessary to be done. And we spoke to them and said, would you hire refugees rather than temporary foreign workers? And all these employers in all these sectors said, you bet we would. We would have loyal people who wouldn't be coming in and going. We wouldn't have to, select them overseas. People would be selected already. We would provide them with opportunities to be trained here. You bet we would. So we put together proposals to hopefully get the Conservative government more interested. They still didn't pick it up. And then we created here in Toronto an organization called Lifeline Syria, which was modeled after Operation Lifeline. And the point of the organization was to raise awareness in the public, promote sponsorship, recruit and train sponsors, help them complete the applications, and then help them once they were matched, and we would monitor them. And Lifeline Syria got a significant amount of attention. And we had public meetings in City Hall where there was standing room only. It was clear that people wanted to do something but didn't know what to do or didn't know how to do it. And in the absence of government leadership, they really didn't know what to do or how to do it. So we were providing them with the tools, explaining to them there is a sponsorship program, and even if the government doesn't bring in government-assisted in significant numbers, you can become involved and bring in privately sponsored refugees. And then the election campaign started. And all of a sudden, the whole issue of Syrian refugees became an election issue. And a positive election issue in the sense that all the political parties were sort of vying with each other about, we'll bring in so many by this date. No, well, we'll bring in that many by this date. No, we'll bring in, and it was sort of a competition, a reluctant one for the Conservative government at the time, but at the Conservative Party at the time, but even they increased their numbers and whatever. Because they indicated publicly that they would do more and bring in more, all of a sudden it gave permission to federal civil servants to start the planning to actually make it happen. And when you have the planning in place for X thousand, if all of a sudden it's raised to 2x or x to the power of 3, you have at least some of the plans in place and some of the contacts in place. And Mike and I were then allowed to not just give brown envelopes under the table, but actually to say, this is what we learned in the Vietnamese movement, and maybe some of this stuff would be helpful to you and could be potentially applied to this new movement. And we certainly did a lot of promotion and publicity. And then the picture of Alan Kurdi. And the picture of Alan Kurdi just changed everything, in everything. You know, the Prime Minister at the time was visibly moved by the picture. The public in Canada went nuts. I mean, Lifeline Syria, our website crashed. We didn't have enough people to answer the phones. People were calling us from all over the country with offers, you know, a little old lady calling in, I can knit hats, and someone else, I live in the Yukon and they may not want to stay here forever, but I have room in my house for 10. You know, they're just people from all over the country wanting to come forward. And then after the election, you know, everybody went into high gear, and the civil service federally, I think, did a fabulous job in rising to the occasion to really up the numbers and get people in. So, I mean, you asked if I still have the opportunity. Well, first of all, I teach immigration refugee policy at Queen's University, so I have the sort of the university platform, if you like. So, but I've also been asked to speak all over the place. In some cases, comparing the Vietnamese movement and the Syrian movement. In other times, comparing the pre-election, post-election, behind-the-scenes stuff on the Syrian situation, the role of civil society in both, and particularly now with the Syrian refugee movement. I, as part of Lifeline Syria, and because of my own personal interests, I reached out to my own synagogue, and we were the first synagogue to sponsor Syrian refugees. But we also got the Board of Rabbis to talk about this from the pulpit at the high holidays, and we got like 37 synagogues in a matter of weeks coming forward to sponsor Syrian refugees. So I'm the lead hand for a sponsorship group, and we started off with a family of 5. We're now up to 13 people that we've sponsored, and we're now submitting another application for one remaining part of the family of another 4 people. So being now a member of a sponsor group, having been sort of a policy wonk in the federal government and then an operations person in the federal government, and then working, I didn't tell you that I then went to the provincial government and worked for many years as a deputy minister in the provincial government, and then as part of the academy, teaching at Queen's and doing research, and then as an advocate, and now as a member of a sponsor group. I've sort of seen refugee sponsorship from a whole variety of angles, and let me tell you, aside from the unaccompanied minor program, nothing has been more gratifying than actually to be a sponsor on the ground with the family that we sponsored. It's just the best opportunity I've ever had in my life.
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us? I mean, if you've said it all, that's good too.
Well, I mean, I always look at an opportunity to say what I think should happen in the future. So, so I'll take advantage of that opportunity. Sure. Several things. One of the reasons why the Indo-Chinese movement and the Syrian movement were so different, although they were the same at the beginning, was that with the Indo-Chinese movement, number one, we recognized the primacy of family. And we selected clans, extended families. We left no one behind in the refugee camps. So it wasn't just mother, father, and kids. It was mother and father and grandmother and grandfather and kids and brothers and sisters and children of brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and anybody who was related to each other in any way, no matter how distant, was selected together and brought together. And that makes a huge difference in terms of settlement. We have gone now to a nuclear family definition, even for refugee selection. And I think that does not serve us well and creates difficulties. And I think we really need to first and foremost think about a refugee-specific family reunification program that is separate from regular family reunification programs where the expectations are very different, and make sure that families are not broken up, particularly if they're in refugee situations. I think that that's really key to effective settlement so that people can get on with their lives. If you're worried about your mother, your father, who's left behind, it's very difficult to go forward. With the Vietnamese program, we even had an orderly departure program where after people were here, if families were still in Vietnam, rather than saying, we can't bring you over because you're not a refugee because you have to leave Vietnam before you're considered a refugee, we actually negotiated with the Vietnamese government to allow family members who were in Vietnam to come directly to Canada without having to risk the perilous journey. We don't have that now. And certainly Syria would be very difficult to negotiate an agreement with, I understand, but there are still some things that we could do potentially that we are not doing. So that's piece number one. We need to have a refugee family reunification program. Right now, the private sponsorship program has become a family reunification program, which means that we don't really have the neighborhood groups or the dog walking clubs or the book clubs coming together and saying, we'll sponsor anyone, government tell us who's in need and we'll sponsor. They have to come forward with the name of a family that they're going to sponsor. And how do they get those names? Because when families arrive here, let's say from Syria, day one they tell their sponsor, thank you so much for sponsoring me. And day two they say, now could you please sponsor my mother, my father, my sister, my brother? And those names then become the names that the private sponsor submits, or they get their friends to become the private sponsors because they're still sponsoring the first family. Please bring in their brother, their sister, whatever. So the private sponsorship movement is really a backhanded, backdoor family unification program. And I say, let's have a family unification program that is a family unification program for refugees, and let's have a private sponsorship program where it's not necessarily only named people, but it is the people most in need, identified by the UN or identified by people that we have in the camps. Maybe in the future, God willing, we will have some role overseas in selection again. Because I think that we're intersecting the two programs in a way that is difficult. So that's number one. Number two, I think the arbitrary distinction between government-assisted refugees and privately sponsored refugees in terms of the supports and services that they get makes no sense. So the government-assisted refugees now that are coming in are the most vulnerable. They are the ones identified by the UNHCR as the ones most in need of resettlement. The privately sponsored refugees are generally the ones who already have family here, so that they have a leg up already because they have a built-in support system. These folks generally have no support system. And all they have are the settlement organizations or the RAP organizations, who are wonderful people, expert at what they do, but they can't provide the wraparound supports that either family members do or sponsors do. I mean, as a sponsor, I and my whole sponsor group was there to help the refugees that we sponsored. If it was 2 o'clock in the morning or a Sunday morning or late at night, they needed something, we were there. We had them over to our homes. We did recreational activities with them. People who work in settlement organizations don't have the time. They have caseloads up the wazoo, and they don't provide that kind of wraparound support. So the most vulnerable refugees do not get the wraparound support that the privately sponsored refugees do with both their family members and the sponsor groups. There has to be a better way to ensure that every refugee that comes forward gets the expert advice of the settlement sector, plus the wraparound support of Jane and Joe Q Public, who just want to be their friends and just want to help them in whatever way they can. So I think those two, I think they're major policy issues. I don't think they're sort of tweaking. I think we have to re-look at our whole refugee settlement system. We now have blended visa office referred cases, which are people who are referred by the UNHCR, so they are vulnerable, but they have the benefit of a sponsor. They get 6 months from the government and 6 months from the private sponsor, but there doesn't seem to be particular criteria that would differentiate BVORs, the blended visa officer referred people, from the GARs. So there doesn't seem to be much logic in our resettlement program now. And I think that given there are fewer and fewer and fewer resettlement places in the world, given that America has basically closed down, Australia is not taking very many at all, other countries are building walls and putting up barbed wire fences, that we have to figure out what is our long-term trajectory and how can our limited resources be used most effectively. And that will involve making the sponsorship of refugees or the assistance of refugees part of Canadians' DNA. So it's not just a one-shot deal when a crisis arises, because there are crises every single day. We're just not hearing about them, but there are crises all over the world every single day. On the other hand, I don't think Canadians can shoulder the world's crises, but we have to figure out how best to do what we do so well, and I think we have some learning to do.
Thanks very much.